The War in Heaven. In the silent archives of the Black Library, among texts so ancient that their very existence defies mortal comprehension, there lies a record of the galaxy's first and greatest apocalypse. A war so vast, so utterly devastating, that the conflicts of the present age are but echoes of its thunder. This was the War in Heaven, a cosmic struggle that raged approximately 60 million years before the birth of the Imperium, before the rise of humanity, before even the stars themselves were born into configurations recognizable to modern astronomers. Every tragedy that unfolds across the blood-soaked battlefields of the 41st millennium can trace its origins to this primordial catastrophe. The very nature of the warp, the existence of chaos, the awakening Necron legions, the proud Aeldari, the brutal orcs, all are children of this ancient conflict. To understand the War in Heaven is to glimpse the foundation upon which all subsequent history was built, a foundation cracked and bleeding, forever marked by the clash of gods. The galaxy was a different place in those forgotten aeons. Life flourished across countless worlds under the careful stewardship of beings whose very existence transcended mortal understanding. The warp itself was calm, an ocean of psychic energy unmarred by the tumultuous storms that would later plague those who dare traverse it. In this primordial paradise, two forces existed that would shape the destiny of all life to come. They were beings of such power that calling them gods seems almost inadequate, yet that is perhaps the only word that captures their terrible majesty. On one side stood the Old Ones, ancient masters of reality itself, patient and methodical in their manipulation of life and time. On the other lurked entities of pure energy, star-fed horrors that would come to be known as the C'tan. Between them arose a mortal species driven by jealousy, suffering, and an all-consuming hatred that would ultimately doom the galaxy to an eternity of war. The Old Ones represented everything the universe might have been. They were an ancient species, possibly reptilian in nature, though records are fragmentary and often contradictory. What is known with certainty is that they possessed a slow, cold-blooded wisdom that allowed them to study the cosmos with patience measured in millennia. Where younger species saw chaos, the Old Ones perceived patterns. They raised astronomy and astrology to heights that blurred the line between science and sorcery, understanding the universe at such a fundamental level that they could manipulate alternate dimensions and engage in works of psychic engineering that remain unmatched to this day. Their crowning achievement was the Webway, a labyrinthine network of hyperspatial tunnels that allowed instantaneous travel between distant stars without the dangers of warp travel. These passages threaded through the space between real space and the Imperium, protected by intricate psychic wards that kept the denizens of the warp at bay. The Old Ones did not hoard their paradise. Instead, they spread across the galaxy as gardeners of life itself, seeding barren worlds with carefully crafted ecosystems and nurturing primitive species towards sentience. They visited countless planets, including Terra, where they influenced the evolution of tree-dwelling primates that would, millions of years hence, give rise to humanity. Their motivation remains a subject of speculation among those few scholars who even know of their existence. Were they benevolent stewards seeking to fill the cosmos with diverse life? Or were they conducting some vast experiment whose true purpose died with them? Whatever their reasons, the Old Ones transformed the galaxy from a sterile wasteland into a thriving garden of countless worlds and species. They were not conquerors, but cultivators, and under their guidance, the Milky Way entered an age of unprecedented harmony. But in the outer reaches of the galaxy, far from the Old Ones' paradises, another species struggled for survival on a world that should never have birthed intelligent life. The planet of the Necrontyr was a nightmare of radiation and cosmic horror, orbiting a star so malignant that its very light was poison. The inhabitants of this doomed world lived short, agonizing lives, their flesh ravaged from birth by the mutagenic radiation that saturated every atom of their environment. Cancer was not a disease among the Necrontyr, but a guarantee written into every cell of their bodies. Children knew from their earliest moments that death waited for them, not as an eventual certainty, but as an immediate companion. The average Necrontyr lifespan was measured in decades at best, and those years were filled with constant pain as their own bodies betrayed them. Their cities were built as much for the dead as the living, vast necropolis complexes where the dying could see the monuments that awaited them. Every cultural achievement, every work of art or science was shadowed by the knowledge that its creator would soon join the countless billions already entombed beneath the surface. Despite their suffering, or perhaps because of it, the Necrontyr developed into a technologically sophisticated civilization. They could not change their bodies through biological means. Their damaged genetic code was too far gone for that. So instead, they turned their genius toward escaping their doomed world. Over thousands of years, they developed spacefaring technology, though it was primitive compared to what would come later. Their ships were slow, requiring stasis crypts to keep crews alive during the centuries-long journeys between stars. There was no glory in these expeditions, only desperate hope that somewhere among the infinite cosmos, they might find a world where their children could live without constant agony. What they found instead were the works of the Old Ones, thriving civilizations on perfect worlds, species blessed with lifespans that seemed eternal to the cancer-riddled Necrontyr. The discovery did not bring hope. It brought jealousy so profound that it would reshape the galaxy. As the Necrontyr spread slowly across the stars, they discovered more and more evidence of the Old Ones' handiwork. Everywhere they looked, they found paradise denied to them. The resentment festered in the collective consciousness of the Necrontyr race, transforming from mere envy into a hatred that defined their culture. They saw themselves as victims of cosmic injustice, condemned to suffering while these ancient beings hoarded the secrets of immortality. The Necrontyr studied the Old Ones from afar, learning of their incredible longevity, their mastery of the warp, their ability to move between stars in moments, while the Necrontyr crawled between worlds across decades. Every piece of knowledge deepened their bitterness. The Old Ones had the power to help them, could share the secrets that would allow the Necrontyr to escape their radiation-cursed existence. Yet, when emissaries finally made contact, the request was refused. The Old Ones would not, or perhaps could not, share the gifts that made them immortal. The exact reasons for this refusal are lost to history. Perhaps the Old Ones feared what such a bitter, suffering species might do with eternal life. Perhaps their immortality was intrinsic to their nature and could not be transferred. Or perhaps they simply did not care about the plight of one doomed species among the millions they had seeded across the stars. The Necrontyr political structure at this time was dominated by the Triarch, a ruling council of 3 powerful pharaohs from major dynasties. At the apex of this triumvirate stood the Silent King, a hereditary position named for the tradition that its holder never spoke directly to subjects, instead allowing the other 2 pharaohs to voice his will. During this crucial period, the Silent King was Zarek of the Zarakan dynasty, a leader who would become the most pivotal figure in galactic history. Zarek inherited not just a throne, but a civilization fracturing under the weight of its own misery. The Necrontyr dynasties, scattered across numerous star systems, were beginning to turn on each other in conflicts known as the Wars of Secession. Regional lords, each ruling their own stellar domains, saw no reason to maintain loyalty to a central authority that could offer them nothing but shared suffering. The Triarch desperately needed something to unite the increasingly fractious dynasties before the Necrontyr civilization tore itself apart in civil war. In the refusal of the Old Ones, Zarek saw opportunity. Here was an external enemy, powerful enough to be threatening, alien enough to be hated, and guilty of the crime that every Necrontyr felt most keenly, possessing immortality while refusing to share it. The Silent King declared war on the Old Ones, offering amnesty to any secessionist dynasties that would reunite under the Triarch's banner to fight this greater enemy. The promise was seductive. If they could defeat the Old Ones, they might claim the secrets of immortality by force. The spoils of victory would be nothing less than freedom from the curse that had haunted the Necrontyr since their species first looked up at their poisonous sun and despaired. One by one, the rebellious dynasties abandoned their petty conflicts and rallied to the Silent King's call. The wars of secession ended not through reconciliation, but through the redirection of hate toward a common foe. The war in heaven had begun. The first phase of the war was a catastrophe for the Necrontyr. Despite their advanced technology and unified purpose, they were hopelessly outmatched. The Old Ones possessed advantages that rendered conventional warfare almost meaningless. Through the webway, they could deploy forces anywhere in the galaxy instantaneously, while Necrontyr fleets required years to move between star systems. Every time the Necrontyr assembled an invasion force, the Old Ones simply evaded through the webway, appearing elsewhere to strike at undefended Necrontyr worlds. The few times they did engage directly, the Old Ones wielded weapons that seemed like magic to their enemies, psychic technologies that could unmake matter at the molecular level or trap entire armies in pocket dimensions. The Necrontyr fought with the desperate fury of the dying, which is precisely what they were, but fury alone could not overcome such a fundamental disparity in capability. Battle after battle ended in defeat. Entire dynasties were annihilated, their tomb complexes left empty save for monuments to warriors who would never return. Over the course of what must have been centuries, though records from this period are fragmentary, the Necrontyr were systematically pushed back. The Old Ones did not pursue genocide, perhaps out of mercy or perhaps simple indifference, but they drove the invaders to the very edge of the galaxy. The Necrontyr found themselves confined to the halo stars, the dim and scattered suns that marked the boundary between galactic civilization and the intergalactic void. Here, clinging to existence on marginal worlds, the Necrontyr faced the reality that their great crusade had failed. They were not just defeated, but humiliated, reduced from a galactic threat to what the Old Ones must have considered a minor nuisance safely contained on the frontier. The unity that Sarek had forged began to fracture once again as the Second Wars of Secession erupted. The dynasties, with no common enemy capable of defeating them and no hope of claiming the immortality they craved, turned their weapons on each other once more. The Silent King watched his civilization crumble, knowing that without a miracle, the Necrontyr would destroy themselves through internal conflict long before the Old Ones bothered to finish them. It was in this darkest hour, when the Necrontyr teetered on the brink of extinction, that they discovered something in the stars themselves. Accounts differ on the exact nature of this discovery. Some archives suggest it was a chance finding during a scientific probe investigating the properties of dying stars. The Aeldari Book of Mournful Night claims something more ominous, that the raw hatred radiating from the Necrontyr acted as a psychic beacon, drawing ancient predators from the stars themselves. What cannot be disputed is that the Necrontyr found entities living within stars, beings of pure electromagnetic energy that fed on stellar radiation. These creatures existed in a state beyond conventional matter, patterns of force and energy that possessed consciousness and terrible hunger. They had existed since the early epochs of the universe, evolving alongside the first stars, and over billions of years, they had developed an insatiable appetite for energy in all its forms. The Necrontyr named them the Catan, meaning star gods in their language, and in their desperation, they saw salvation. The Catan were utterly alien to mortal comprehension. As beings of living energy dwelling within stars, they possessed no conventional form, existing as patterns of electromagnetic force held together by something approaching will. They were vast, far larger than any planet, and possessed power that dwarfed anything the Necrontyr had imagined. Yet, they were also trapped, confined to the stars they fed upon, unable to interact with the material universe in any meaningful way. The Necrontyr, in their brilliance born of desperation, offered the Catan a gift. They would construct bodies of living metal, a substance they called necrodermis, that could contain the essence of a Catan while allowing it to manifest in the physical realm. In these bodies, the star gods could experience the material universe, feed on more diverse forms of energy, and wield their terrible power without restriction. The Necrontyr framed this as a service between equals, one species helping another to achieve a shared goal, the destruction of the Old Ones. The first Catan to accept this offer was Azagorod, the Nightbringer, discovered feeding on the very star that had cursed the Necrontyr with its deadly radiation. The Nightbringer was the first to cross what the Necrontyr called the incorporeal starlight bridge, transferring its consciousness into a body of shimmering necrodermis prepared for it. The moment of its manifestation must have been terrifying beyond description. The Nightbringer emerged as a towering figure of living metal, radiating power that bent reality around it. Its first action upon tasting the energies of mortal life was to feed, not on stars, but on the Necrontyr who had brought it into being. The god they had created began consuming them wholesale, draining their life essences with an appetite that threatened to devour the entire species. Only through frantic pledges of eternal servitude and promises of better feeding did the Necrontyr convince the Nightbringer to spare them and turn its hunger toward the broader galaxy. The pattern was set. The Necrontyr had not freed the Catan, they had unleashed them. Other Catan followed the Nightbringer across the bridge between states of being. Mephatron, known to the Necrontyr as the Messenger, but to its fellow Catan as the Deceiver, was among the first. Unlike the Nightbringer, which reveled in pure destruction, the Deceiver possessed cunning that verged on prescience. It accumulated followers not through terror, but through manipulation, whispering promises and half-truths that made its servants believe they were acting in their own interest. The Deceiver was one of the weaker Catan in terms of raw power, but it compensated through guile, even sending its own worshippers to serve other Catan to curry favor and avoid the fate of being consumed by stronger star gods. Magladroth, the Void Dragon, emerged as perhaps the most powerful of all Citan, a being whose mastery over matter itself allowed it to manipulate the very fabric of reality. Iashudra, the Endless Swarm, Tsaranoga, the Outsider, Niadrazata, the Burning One, each Citan that manifested brought unique and terrifying capabilities to the material realm. They were not gods in the way later species would understand divinity, but they were as close to godhood as the material universe could support. Beings whose power operated on scales that made them functionally omnipotent to lesser species. The Citan proved to be as cruel as they were powerful. Perhaps exposure to the material universe corrupted them, or perhaps this had always been their nature. But in physical form, they became monsters of sadism and excess. They demanded worship from the Necrontyr and reveled in the religious devotion of their followers, even as that devotion frequently drove worshippers mad. Being in the presence of a Citan was psychologically devastating. The Nightbringer's followers experienced endless visions of death and bloodshed, their minds assaulted by the fundamental concept of mortality that the star god embodied. Many descended into homicidal mania or catatonia. The Deceiver's followers were so numerous it had to redirect some to worship other Citan, lest its brother gods grow jealous and attack it. The C'tan feasted not just on stars, but on the electromagnetic life energy of mortal beings, finding the taste of sentient life far more satisfying than stellar radiation. They organized red harvests, methodical genocides where entire planetary populations were drained of life to sate the endless hunger of the star gods. It was the deceiver who approached Sarek with the proposal that would doom the Necrontyr forever. The star god came before the Silent King with honeyed words, speaking of ancient conflicts between the C'tan and the Old Ones, claiming that the two races shared a common enemy and should thus share a common cause. The deceiver promised that the C'tan would grant the Necrontyr two gifts. First, technology of godlike power that would allow them to defeat the Old Ones. Second, and more seductively, immortality. The C'tan offered to free the Necrontyr from their cursed flesh, to transfer their consciousness into bodies of living metal identical to those the C'tan themselves wore. In these new forms, they would be immune to disease, to radiation, to death itself. They would have eternity to pursue their vengeance against the Old Ones. All the Silent King had to do was agree. The Triarch convened to debate this offer, discussions that lasted a full year. Only one voice spoke against accepting the bargain. Orican the Diviner, the court astrologer, warned that the C'tan could not be trusted, that this path led to damnation rather than salvation. But Orican's warnings were drowned out by the desperate hope of countless billions who saw in the C'tan's offer their only chance to escape the horror of their existence. Sarek, last of the Silent Kings, accepted the bargain. Vast bio-furnaces were constructed across Necrontyr worlds, cyclopean machines designed by the C'tan and built by Necrontyr hands. As the appointed time approached, not all dynasties went willingly. Some, like the warriors who would become Trazyn the Infinite and Orican the Diviner, had to be forced into the furnaces at gunpoint. The Khonsu dynasty resisted until they were overwhelmed by loyalist forces. But the majority of Necrontyr entered the biofoundries voluntarily, even eagerly. They had been promised immortality, freedom from pain, and the power to exact revenge on those who had denied them these gifts. They marched into the flames believing they would emerge reborn. What emerged was something far different from what had entered. The process that became known as biotransference was overseen by Zeros, a cryptech whose name would become synonymous with soulless cruelty. The exact procedures remain mercifully unknown, but the effect is documented in the fragments of Sharek's own chronicles. Each Necrontyr was stripped of flesh and consciousness alike. Their organic bodies consumed as fuel, while their minds were transferred into shells of living metal. Above each furnace, the true forms of the C'tan swooped and dove like carrion birds, glutting themselves on the torrent of spiritual energy released as an entire species was simultaneously killed and preserved. They feasted on souls by the billion, growing stronger with each life consumed, until they blazed with power that threatened to tear holes in reality. The Necrontyr who entered the furnaces emerged as Necrons, but they were shadows of what they had been. The process stripped away more than just flesh. For the vast majority, personality, memory, even basic self-awareness were lost in the transfer. Common citizens became mindless automatons, their consciousness reduced to simple programming that allowed them to follow orders and nothing more. Children, who should have had lifetimes ahead of them to develop into full beings, were transferred into adult-sized frames with their nascent personalities scoured away entirely, leaving only hollow shells. Even the nobility who retained aspects of their former selves found they had been purged of so much that made them individuals. Emotions were dulled, memories fragmented. the fire that had driven them reduced to cold calculation. Xeroc himself underwent the process, emerging in a body of living metal more sophisticated than any other Necron, with neural networks complex enough to preserve most of his personality intact. He looked upon his people and saw what the C'tan had done. The deceiver had kept its promise in the most literal and terrible way. The Necrontyr were immortal. Their bodies could not age, could not be destroyed by radiation, could barely be destroyed at all. But the price was everything that made life worth living. The consciousness that inhabited each metal shell was at best an echo of what had been, a recording playing on repeat rather than a living, growing being. In that moment, standing in a body that would never tire or sicken, yet feeling an emptiness that transcended physical absence, Xeroc understood the full horror of what he had done.
The biotransference protocols he had authorized embedded command codes in every Necron mind, granting him absolute control over his entire species. They would obey without question, without even the capacity to rebel. He had not saved his people, he had murdered them and raised their corpses to serve as weapons. But even in his horror, Sarek recognized that the pact had been sealed in the only way that mattered. The Necrontyr were gone, but the Necrons remained, and they were instruments of war unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The second phase of the war in heaven began not with armies of dying, bitter mortals, but with legions of immortal killing machines backed by the unlimited power of the C'tan. The Old Ones, who had so casually defeated the Necrontyr time and again, found themselves facing an enemy that negated every advantage they had possessed. The Necrons did not need to eat, sleep, or reproduce. Casualties meant nothing when the fallen could be recovered and repaired. Their weapons operated on principles that the Old Ones themselves struggled to counter. Gauss technology that stripped matter atom from atom. Chronometric devices that could age enemies to dust in seconds. Antimatter catalyzers that could crack planets. Most devastating of all was the simple fact that the C'tan, in their physical forms, possessed power on a scale that matched or exceeded the Old Ones themselves. Where the Ancient Ones had been gardeners and cultivators, the C'tan were apex predators, and they had just been given an army. The Old Ones' supremacy in the warp proved meaningless against foes who operated purely in the material realm. The C'tan and their Necron servants were anathema to psychic power, soulless beings who could not be touched by warp-based attacks. The webway, which had allowed the Old Ones to outmaneuver the Necrontyr, was breached when Nyarlathotep the Burning One gifted the Necrons Bedolmen Gates, devices that could forcibly create openings into the ancient transit network. Necron legions poured into the webway, a violation of the Old Ones' most sacred realm. For the first time in millions of years, the Old Ones knew true fear. Their fortresses, thought impregnable, were stormed by tireless warriors who showed no mercy because they had no capacity for it anymore. Their servant species, nurtured for millennia, were harvested by the C'tan in continent-spanning red harvests. Stars themselves were extinguished as the star gods fed, plunging entire systems into freezing darkness. Suns were torn apart to fuel weapons that could crack worlds. Black holes were weaponized, swallowing fleets and planets alike. The scale of destruction wrought during this period defies comprehension. Entire star clusters were rendered lifeless, their inhabitants consumed down to the last microbe. The Old Ones, patient and wise though they were, found themselves driven back step by step. Their mastery of biological and psychic sciences seemed insufficient against the cold perfection of Necron technology and C'tan power. Desperation drove them to measures they would never have considered in more peaceful times. If conventional warfare could not stop the C'tan, perhaps they could create servants specifically designed to fight these star gods.
The Old Ones had always been engineers of life, but now they turned that gift toward war. They seeded worlds with new species, warrior races that possessed powerful connections to the warp. Among the first and most important were the Aeldari, a species crafted with an intrinsic link to the Imperium that allowed them to wield psychic power with grace and precision. The Aeldari were beautiful, long-lived, and deeply connected to the realm of souls in ways that made them anathema to the soulless Citan. They learned quickly from their creators, mastering the use of the webway and developing technologies that blended the psychic and material. Other species followed in rapid succession. The Rashan and Knib, about which little is remembered save that they fought and died in the ancient war. These warrior races were unleashed against the Necron legions and their Citan masters, and for a time they turned the tide of war. Psychic energies were perhaps the only force in the universe that the Citan truly feared. As beings of electromagnetic patterns, they had no defense against attacks that bypassed the material realm entirely. Aeldari farseers could look through time to predict Citan movements. Their warriors wielded weapons that channeled warp energy directly, and each strike burned the star gods in ways conventional weapons could not. The hot-blooded young races, as they came to be known, possessed an intensity and adaptability that the Old Ones themselves lacked. Where the Old Ones had been patient, these new species were aggressive. Where the Old Ones preferred careful planning, these warriors embraced desperate innovation. The Necrons found themselves pushed back for the first time since biotransference. Battle after battle saw Aeldari forces triumphant, their psychic might overwhelming the cold logic of Necron war protocols. For a brief moment, it seemed the Old Ones might actually win the war they had been fighting for uncounted centuries. But they had made a terrible miscalculation, one born of desperation and incomplete understanding of the forces they were manipulating. In creating species so deeply connected to the warp, they had changed the warp itself. The Immaterium, that realm of pure thought and emotion that existed parallel to reality, had been relatively calm before the war in heaven. It was a sea of psychic energy, certainly, but largely formless and benign. The Old Ones had used it as a tool, drawing power from it to fuel their technologies and explorations. But the warp is reactive to the material realm, shaped by the thoughts and emotions of sentient beings. The war in heaven, with its scale of death and suffering measured in the extinction of entire species, poured unimaginable psychic trauma into the Immaterium. Trillions upon trillions of deaths, each one a burst of fear, pain, and despair radiating into the sea of souls. The collective unconscious of the young races, experiencing war on a scale never before seen, flooded the warp with aggression, terror, and hatred.
These emotions were not random static, but concentrated forces, and in the warp, such forces can achieve a terrible kind of sentience. Older entities that had existed as simple patterns in the Immaterium began to change, transformed by this diet of suffering into predatory horrors. The formerly peaceful ocean became a realm of nightmares where demons hunted psychic beings and thoughts themselves could kill. Most terrifying among these new warp entities were creatures that came to be known as enslavers. These beings possessed a unique and nightmarish ability. They could dominate the minds of psychers and use those enslaved hosts as anchors to manifest in the material realm. An enslaver would find a psychically active individual, penetrate their mind with tendrils of immaterial force, and completely override their will. The victim became a hollow puppet, all sense of self erased, existing only to open a permanent gateway through which more enslavers could pour into reality. Once established in a host, enslavers would implant their offspring into the victim's brain. When these eggs hatched, the host's head would explode, releasing a new generation of parasites into the world. The Enslaver Plague, as it came to be known, spread through the galaxy like wildfire through dry grass. The Old Ones servant races, created with powerful psychic abilities specifically to fight the Citan, were uniquely vulnerable to this new threat. Entire armies of Aeldari found themselves turned into doorways for Enslaver invasion. Worlds that had stood against Necron legions for years fell in days as their defenders were transformed into enemies from within. The Old Ones scrambled to create new species that might resist the Enslaver threat. The Krork emerged during this desperate period, massive green-skilled warriors standing 12 meters tall with technology genetically encoded into their very DNA. Unlike the psychically gifted Aeldari, the Krork relied on brutal physical power and an instinctive understanding of technology that required no warp connection to function. They were blunt instruments designed to fight anything that moved without mercy or hesitation. Alongside the Krork came the Jokaero, orange-furred humanoids bearing an uncanny resemblance to Terra's orangutans. The Jokaero possessed an innate, almost unconscious mastery of technology, able to construct weapons and devices of incredible sophistication from the most rudimentary materials. Neither species halted the plague spread. The damage was too extensive, the cracks in reality too numerous. The Old Ones' galactic network of webway portals, once pristine, was being breached by demonic incursions. Their places of power, where they had worked their greatest psychic engineering, became infested with horrors from the deep warp. The paradise they had cultivated for millions of years was burning, and they were powerless to stop it. The final collapse of the Old One civilization was not a single cataclysmic battle, but a gradual dissolution. As the Enslaver Plague ravaged their domains and the Necrons continued their relentless advance, the Old Ones found themselves besieged on all sides. Their legendary patience became a liability when speed was essential. Their mastery of the warp meant nothing when the warp itself had become hostile to them. One by one, their strongholds fell. Some were overrun by Necron legions. Others succumbed to enslaver infestations that turned entire populations into conduits for demonic invasion. The last bastions of Old One civilization fought to the bitter end, but they were fighting a war on 3 fronts against enemies that could not be reasoned with or defeated through conventional means. The Citan and their Necrons wanted nothing less than the complete extinction of the Old Ones. The Enslavers were mindless predators driven by hunger for psychic energy. There was no possibility of peace, no chance for negotiation. The Old Ones were hunted through the galaxy they had once dominated, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, until finally they were no more. Whether the last of them died fighting or fled into dimensions unknown, whether any survived in hidden refuges beyond the galaxy's edge, these questions remain unanswered after 60 million years. With the Old Ones defeated and the galaxy scoured nearly clean of life by the Enslaver Plague, the Citan turned on each other. This was perhaps inevitable. The star gods had been unified only by their common war against the Old Ones, and with that enemy destroyed, old hungers reasserted themselves. The Citan had discovered something during their long war. The life energy of other Citan was far more nourishing than that of any mortal species. The deceiver, ever cunning, whispered to the Nightbringer that the essence of fellow star gods would prove to be the finest feast imaginable. Whether this was truth or manipulation mattered little. The Nightbringer, already the most violent and destructive of the Citan, began hunting its siblings. Other star gods followed suit, either believing the deceiver's promises or simply seeking to eliminate rivals before being eliminated themselves. The resulting conflict, Citan against Citan, was a war of gods that made even the devastation of the war in heaven seem minor by comparison. Entire star systems were destroyed as collateral damage. The laws of physics bent and broke where Citan fought. Some star gods were consumed entirely by their stronger siblings. Others were shattered into fragments. Through it all, the weakest Citan, the deceiver, survived by avoiding direct conflict and manipulating others into fighting on its behalf. Throughout this fratricidal nightmare, Zarek the Silent King watched and waited. The command protocols embedded in every Necron during biotransference gave him absolute control over the entire species. He could not die, could not be overthrown, and wielded his people as a single unified weapon. But he was also the only Necron with sufficient self-awareness to understand the full horror of what had been done. The others, those few who retained any personality at all, believed they had been granted the gift of immortality and power. They did not grasp that they were prisoners in metal shells, that the vibrant beings they had once been were dead and would never return. Zarek understood, and the understanding was a torture worse than any his mortal body had endured. He had saved his species from extinction only to damn them to something far worse. He had sought to defeat the Old Ones and claim immortality, but achieved only the destruction of everything his people had been. Now, as he watched the Citan tear each other apart, he saw opportunity born from desperation. If the star gods were distracted fighting one another, they were vulnerable. If they could be defeated, perhaps the Necrons could finally be free of the masters who had enslaved them. The exact moment Zarek decided to rebel against the Citan is lost to history, but the planning must have taken centuries. He could not simply order his legions to attack. The Citan were far too powerful for brute force. Each star god possessed reality-warping capabilities that made them functionally invincible to conventional weapons. They had consumed the life energy of entire species and grown stronger with each feeding. They had survived wars against the Old Ones themselves. Direct confrontation would be suicide, no matter how many Necron warriors were thrown into battle. Instead, Zarek turned to the Cryptex, those Necrons who had retained enough of their former brilliance to continue pushing the boundaries of science and technology. He tasked them with a project that seemed impossible: find a way to kill a god. The Cryptex labored in secret, hidden from the Citan's awareness by the simple fact that the star gods had never considered their Necron servants capable of rebellion. Why would they? The Necrons were tools, programmed to obey, lacking the spark of will necessary for betrayal. This arrogance would prove to be their downfall. The solution the Cryptex developed was as brilliant as it was terrible. They could not destroy the Citan, but they could shatter them. Working from principles of necrodermis technology, the same living metal that gave the Citan their physical forms, the Cryptex designed weapons specifically calibrated to fragment the star god's consciousness into countless shards. Each shard would retain a fraction of the original entity's power and personality, but would be manageable, controllable, able to be imprisoned within specially designed containment vessels. The challenge lay in deploying these weapons. The Citan, even weakened by their wars against each other, were still gods. They could destroy entire fleets with a thought, unmake matter with a gesture. Timing was everything. Zarek waited until the Citan had exhausted themselves fighting one another, until their attention was fully consumed by their divine conflicts. Then, at the moment of maximum vulnerability, he struck with every Necron legion simultaneously. The scale of betrayal was total. Every Necron warrior throughout the galaxy received the same command at the same instant: turn on the Citan and do not stop until they are shattered. The war between the Necrons and their former masters was brief but apocalyptic. The Citan, caught off guard by the sudden rebellion of their slaves, initially responded with fury that nearly broke the Necron assault.
Azagara, the Nightbringer alone, destroyed dozens of tomb complexes, its death-bringing powers reducing millions of Necron warriors to their component atoms. Magladroth, the Void Dragon, warped reality around itself, creating zones where the laws of physics simply ceased to function.
where Necron soldiers found their bodies transforming into crystalline structures or evaporating into clouds of probability. But the Necrons had numbers beyond counting, an entire species unified in purpose, and they had weapons specifically designed to exploit the one weakness the Ceton possessed. The Star Gods, for all their power, were bound to their necrodermis shells. It was these shells that the Necrons targeted, not with the intention of destroying them, but of fracturing them into pieces. When the first Ceton shattered, its scream echoed through both material space and the warp, a sound of such anguish that psychic species throughout the galaxy experienced spontaneous nightmares for months afterward. One by one, the Ceton fell. Iyashudra, the endless swarm, was fragmented into thousands of shards, each one imprisoned in a separate tesseract labyrinth. Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, whose gift of Dolmen Gate technology had allowed the Necrons to breach the webway, was betrayed and shattered despite its protests of loyalty. Tsaranoga, the Outsider, was driven mad by the Deceiver, tricked into consuming fellow Ceton until the horror of what it had done caused a complete psychological fracture. It fled to a pocket dimension beyond the galaxy's edge, where it remains to this day, insane and trapped. The Void Dragon proved nearly impossible to defeat, its mastery over matter allowing it to repair damage as quickly as it was inflicted. The battle against Magladroth cost the Necrons entire dynasties. Billions of warriors sacrificed in wave after wave of attacks designed not to win, but to exhaust. Finally, through methods that remain classified even in Necron records, the Void Dragon was subdued and imprisoned. Some fragmentary accounts suggest the dragon was not shattered like its siblings, but was instead locked away whole within a facility buried deep beneath Mars' surface, though this claim is disputed and potentially mythological. The Nightbringer and Deceiver, perhaps the most powerful and cunning of the Ceton respectively, each managed to preserve larger shards of themselves when finally broken. These greater fragments retained significant power and consciousness, becoming prized possessions of Necron dynasties wealthy and bold enough to attempt wielding them. The process of shattering the Ceton and containing their fragments became a grim harvest that lasted centuries. Each shard had to be imprisoned in a tesseract labyrinth, a device that existed partially outside normal space-time and could theoretically contain the Star God fragment forever. These prisons were engineering marvels, pocket dimensions folded in on themselves so many times that escape became mathematically impossible. Yet even imprisoned, the Ceton shards remained dangerous. Their mere presence could drive lesser beings mad. Their whispers could corrupt those who came too close. Necron overlords who possessed Ceton shards treated them with a mixture of reverence and terror, aware that the fragments of their former gods were simultaneously the most powerful weapons they owned and the most likely to destroy them. Some dynasties built entire fortress complexes around their Ceton shards, with multiple redundant containment systems and standing orders to destroy the facility entirely if the shard showed any sign of breaking free. Others, more ambitious or foolhardy, attempted to communicate with their captive fragments, seeking knowledge or power. Invariably, these attempts ended in disaster, with the Ceton shard manipulating its captors into actions that served the fragment's inscrutable goals. With the Ceton defeated and the galaxy scoured nearly lifeless by the Enslaver Plague, Zarek faced the question of what came next. The Necrons controlled a galaxy of tomb worlds, but it was a hollow victory. They had destroyed their gods, but they remained imprisoned in metal bodies, stripped of the life they had sought to preserve. The biotransference could not be reversed. The Cryptex tried, spending centuries attempting to restore organic forms to their species, but the process was irreversible. The souls that had once inhabited Necrontyr bodies had been consumed by the Ceton during the transfer. There was nothing left to restore. Each Necron was a recording of a person who no longer existed, a ghost that did not realize it was already dead. For many Necrons, this revelation would have been devastating. For Zarek, who bore the guilt of having led his entire species to this fate, it was unbearable.
He had succeeded in his initial goal, defeating the Old Ones who had refused his people the gift of immortality, but that victory was revealed as meaningless. The Necrontyr had gained immortality only by ceasing to be Necrontyr. They had become something else, something that would endure eternally but would never truly live. The galaxy itself was dying around them. The Enslaver Plague had transformed the Imperium into a raging storm of psychic horror. Any species with even minor psychic potential was vulnerable to possession and transformation into gateways for more enslavers. The few surviving species from the War in Heaven, primarily the Aeldari and the devolving Krork, had retreated to scattered strongholds where they fought desperate holding actions against the tide of possession. Entire sectors of space were rendered lifeless as the enslavers consumed every psychically active being they could reach. The warp itself had become so turbulent that conventional warp travel was suicide. Only the Old One's webway remained safe, and even that was compromised in countless locations where enslavers or demons had breached its walls. The Necrons, as soulless beings with no presence in the warp, were immune to the Enslaver Plague, but they found themselves rulers of an empty kingdom. There was nothing left to conquer, no one left to fight, no purpose to their continued existence. They had won the war and lost everything that made victory meaningful. Zarek convened the remaining Necron nobility, those overlords and pharaons whose consciousness had survived biotransference relatively intact.
The council that assembled represented the most powerful Necron dynasties, each one controlling fleets and armies that could sterilize entire sectors if unleashed. The Silent King presented them with a stark choice. They could remain active in a galaxy that had nothing left to offer them, gradually deteriorating as even their necrodermis bodies succumbed to the ravages of deep time. Or they could enter stasis, retreating to tomb worlds scattered throughout the galaxy and waiting in dreamless sleep until the galaxy had healed and new life had arisen to replace what had been lost. It was not a difficult choice. The Necrons were not alive in any meaningful sense, but neither did they desire to face eternity in an empty cosmos. The Great Sleep, as it came to be called, was implemented across every Necron dynasty. Tomb worlds were prepared, massive stasis crypts constructed deep beneath the surfaces of lifeless planets. Each tomb was equipped with sophisticated monitoring systems designed to wake its inhabitants when conditions became favorable. What constituted favorable varied by dynasty. Some programmed their tombs to wake when sufficient organic life had returned to the galaxy. Others set timers measured in millions of years. A few paranoid overlords programmed their systems to wake at the slightest disturbance, determined not to be caught vulnerable should enemies discover their resting places. Before entering the Great Sleep himself, Zarek made a decision that would define the next 60 million years of galactic history. He destroyed the command protocols that gave him absolute control over the Necron species. The subroutines embedded in every Necron mind during biotransference were erased, freeing each dynasty to act independently when they eventually woke. Some among his court protested this decision, arguing that unity had allowed the Necrons to defeat the Catan and would be necessary to face whatever threats arose in the future. Zarek rejected these arguments. He had led his people to damnation through his absolute authority. He had made decisions that doomed billions based on his judgment alone, and his judgment had proven catastrophically flawed. He would not carry that burden into the future. When the Necrons woke, they would be free to choose their own paths, for good or ill. Having made this final act of leadership, Zarek entered his own stasis tomb alongside his people. The galaxy fell silent, its former masters sleeping in darkness, while the wounds of the war in heaven slowly scarred over. The Aeldari,
one of the few species to survive the War in Heaven and the Enslaver Plague, inherited the ruins of galactic civilization. They had been created as warrior servants, psychically powerful soldiers designed to fight the Catan and their Necron legions. With their creators gone and their enemies asleep, the Aeldari found themselves without purpose or guidance. Over millions of years, they evolved from a warrior species into something far more complex. They expanded across the galaxy, not as conquerors, but as artists and philosophers, building a civilization that valued beauty, knowledge, and experience above all else. The Aeldari mastered the webway left behind by the Old Ones, maintaining and even expanding the ancient transit network. They established craft worlds, massive vessels that could house billions and traverse the stars without ever touching the warp. At the height of their power, the Aeldari Empire spanned the entire galaxy, with populations numbering in the trillions spread across countless worlds. They believed themselves to be the galaxy's rightful inheritors, the children of the Old Ones who had survived where all others had fallen. The Krork, those massive warriors created to fight with brute strength rather than psychic power, followed a different path. Without the guidance and genetic engineering of the Old Ones to maintain their sophisticated forms, the Krork began to devolve. Over millions of years of natural selection and environmental pressure, they slowly transformed into a less refined but more adaptable species. The Krork's genetically encoded technology became simpler, cruder, but also more robust. Their size decreased from 12 meters to a more manageable 2 or 3 meters. Their sophisticated strategic thinking gave way to instinctive aggression, tempered by a crude but effective cunning. These devolved Krork would eventually become known as orcs, a species that retained the essential characteristics of their ancestors: the green skin, the instinctive understanding of technology, the love of battle, but had lost the discipline and intelligence that made the Krork such formidable warriors. The orcs spread across the galaxy in scattered tribes and warbands, fighting each other when no other enemies presented themselves, but always ready to unite under powerful war bosses when the call to war sounded. Other young races fared less well. The Rashan and Knib, if they survived at all, left no lasting mark on the galaxy. Perhaps they destroyed each other in the chaos following the War in Heaven. Perhaps they evolved into forms unrecognizable from what the Old Ones had created. The Jokero remained, scattered across numerous worlds where they lived in primitive societies, their sophisticated technology crafting abilities intact but disconnected from any larger cultural context. They built individual masterpieces of engineering, but lacked the social cohesion to form a true civilization. Observers in later millennia would puzzle over how such primitive-seeming creatures could construct weapons and devices that rivaled the best Imperial technology, never realizing these orange-furred artisans were the deliberately crafted products of the Old Ones' genetic engineering. The young races, designed as weapons against the Cetan, had to find new purposes in a galaxy no longer at war. Some succeeded, others faded into obscurity or extinction. All carried within their genetic codes the legacy of a conflict most of them no longer remembered. As millions of years passed, new species arose through natural evolution rather than deliberate engineering. Humanity emerged on Terra, a world the Old Ones had visited but not heavily modified, and slowly spread across the stars. The Tau evolved on a planet in the Eastern Fringe, developing technology and philosophy that would challenge the established order of the galaxy.
Countless other species arose, flourished, and sometimes fell into extinction, each one adding new threads to the complex weave of galactic civilization. None of these younger species knew of the War in Heaven. To them, the universe had always been as they found it, a vast expanse of stars and worlds to explore and claim. They discovered evidence of the ancient war, certainly. Dead worlds scoured of life, mysterious artifacts of impossible sophistication, ruins that defied explanation, but they lacked context to understand what they had found. Some species, like humanity's tech priests of Mars, venerated these ancient artifacts as holy relics without comprehending their true origins. Others, like the Aeldari, possessed fragmentary knowledge passed down through millions of years, but even they had lost most of the truth to the erosion of time. Deep beneath the surface of countless worlds, the Necrons slept on, their stasis systems humming with barely perceptible energy as they waited for conditions that would trigger their awakening. The tomb worlds were scattered throughout the galaxy, from the core to the rim, in systems both inhabited and empty. Some had been deliberately hidden, their locations known only to the dynasties that built them. Others were placed in plain sight, their surface ruins serving as warnings to any who might disturb what lay below. The stasis technology was reliable but not perfect. Occasional malfunctions caused individual Necrons or small groups to wake prematurely, emerging into a galaxy they did not recognize, filled with organic life they had thought extinct. These early risers usually went mad or were destroyed by the new civilizations that had arisen in their absence. A few managed to return to stasis, reporting their findings to sleeping dynasties before shutting down once more. Through these scattered awakenings, information about the changed galaxy slowly accumulated in Necron databases, waiting for the day when the tomb worlds would wake in earnest. The first major awakenings began occurring during the Age of Strife, that period of human history when warp storms isolated colony worlds and Terra lost contact with its far-flung settlements. The coinciding was not accidental. Many Necron tomb worlds had programmed their awakening sequences to trigger when warp activity reached certain thresholds, reasoning that increased Imperium turbulence indicated the galaxy had recovered sufficiently to be worth reclaiming. These early awakenings were disorganized and often catastrophic. Stasis systems that had functioned perfectly for 60 million years suddenly failed all at once. Entire tomb worlds woke to find their populations had degraded, their higher functions corrupted or destroyed by the slow decay of time. Some Necrons emerged as little more than automatons, their already limited consciousness reduced to basic combat protocols. Others woke with their memories scrambled, unable to remember who they were or why they had entered stasis. The most tragic cases involved overlords who woke alone, their entire dynasties destroyed by stasis failures, leaving them as the last remnants of civilizations that had once commanded billions. Those Necrons who woke intact faced a galaxy transformed beyond recognition. The Aeldari, whom they remembered as recently created servants of the Old Ones, now dominated galactic civilization as an empire of unmatched sophistication and power. Humanity, a species that had not even existed when the Necrons went to sleep, had spread across countless worlds and established its own interstellar empire. The warp, which had been a raging storm of Enslaver-spawned horror when the Great Sleep began, had calmed somewhat, though it remained far more dangerous than it had been before the War in Heaven. The Necrons found themselves strangers in what had once been their galaxy, facing enemies they did not understand and allies they could not trust. Some dynasties attempted to reclaim their former territories, launching wars of conquest against the organic species that now inhabited worlds the Necrons considered rightfully theirs. Others took a more cautious approach, sending scouts to gather information before committing to action. A few, most notably Trazyn the Infinite, became collectors and historians, seeking to understand what had happened during their long sleep and preserve artifacts from every era of galactic history. The internal politics of awakened Necron dynasties proved as complex as their external conflicts. Without the Silent King's command protocols to enforce unity, each dynasty was independent and free to pursue its own agenda. Old rivalries that had been suppressed during the War in Heaven resurged immediately. The Saltec dynasty, one of the most powerful, sought to establish hegemony over lesser dynasties through diplomacy backed by overwhelming military force. The Nihilak dynasty, focused on reclaiming and defending its territory, treating any incursion, whether by organic species or rival Necrons, as an act of war deserving immediate retaliation. The Mefrit dynasty pursued campaigns of aggressive expansion, seeking to rebuild the empire that had once made them feared throughout the stars. Disagreements over strategy, territorial claims, and the fundamental question of what the Necrons should become in this new galaxy led to conflicts between dynasties, civil wars fought with the same tireless determination that had characterized the War in Heaven. Some overlords sought to reunite the Necron species under a single banner, while others valued their newfound independence and resisted any attempt at centralized control. The return of Zarek, the Silent King, further complicated Necron politics. After millions of years wandering the intergalactic void, confronting horrors in the darkness between galaxies, Zarek returned to the Milky Way with warnings of an approaching threat. The Tyranids, an extragalactic species of biological nightmares, were consuming galaxies as they advanced toward the Milky Way. Unlike other species that could be negotiated with, enslaved, or even grudgingly respected, the Tyranids offered only total consumption. They devoured all biomass, leaving nothing behind but lifeless husks of worlds. Most significantly for the Necrons, the Tyranid advance left the galaxy empty of the organic life the Necrons needed if they ever hoped to reverse biotransference. Sarek's solution was as pragmatic as it was distasteful. He argued that the Necrons must ally with organic species, at least temporarily, to defeat the Tyranid threat. The Tyranids, an extragalactic species of biological nightmares, were consuming galaxies as they advanced toward the Milky Way. Unlike other species that could be negotiated with, enslaved, or even grudgingly respected, the Tyranids offered only total consumption. They devoured all biomass, leaving nothing behind but lifeless husks of worlds. Most significantly for the Necrons, the Tyranid advance left the galaxy empty of the organic life the Necrons needed if they ever hoped to reverse biotransference. Sarek's solution was as pragmatic as it was distasteful. He argued that the Necrons must ally with organic species, at least temporarily, to defeat the Tyranid threat. Once the Tyranids were destroyed, the Necrons could return to their goal of reclaiming bodies of flesh. This proposal met with mixed reception. Some dynasties, recognizing the logic of Sarek's arguments, pledged themselves to his leadership once more. Others rejected his authority, pointing out that he had abdicated his position as Silent King and had no right to command them. Still others questioned whether reversing biotransference was even possible or desirable after 60 million years. The modern Necron species thus finds itself divided and uncertain, a far cry from the unified force that once shattered the Cetan and fought the Old Ones to extinction. They possess technology that makes them among the most dangerous military forces in the galaxy. Their ships can phase through solid matter, their weapons can strip molecules apart or age enemies to dust, and their warriors can repair damage that would destroy any organic being. Yet they are also afflicted with madness born of their transformation and the slow degradation of their consciousness over millions of years. Destroyer cults arose among some Necrons, warriors who became obsessed with the eradication of all life and saw biotransference not as a curse but as transcendence beyond the weakness of flesh. Flayed ones emerged, Necrons driven mad by the sensory deprivation of their metal bodies, who took to wearing the skins of organic victims in a futile attempt to remember what it felt like to be alive. The Necrons are simultaneously the galaxy's most ancient civilization and its most damaged one, bearing scars from a war that ended before most current species even existed. The various Cetan shards imprisoned by the Necron dynasties remain wildcards in the equation of galactic power. Each shard retains a fragment of its original consciousness and abilities, making them devastating weapons when properly deployed.
However, they also remain fundamentally hostile to their captors, seeking any opportunity to manipulate circumstances toward their eventual escape. Some Necron overlords have developed almost symbiotic relationships with their C10 shards, learning to predict and account for the Star God fragments' deceptions well enough to employ them safely in battle. Others have sworn never to release their shards under any circumstances, viewing them as too dangerous to risk deploying regardless of potential benefits. There are whispered accounts of C10 shards that have successfully escaped their containment and fled into the galaxy at large. These free shards, whether they represent the Nightbringer, Deceiver, or some other star god, pursue their own incomprehensible agendas, leaving trails of destruction or manipulation that confound those who encounter them. The full implications of having fragments of reality-warping star gods scattered across the galaxy remain unknown, but most Imperial scholars who learn of the C10's existence conclude that their mere presence represents an existential threat to all organic life. The physical evidence of the war in heaven remains scattered throughout the galaxy for those who know where to look and have the expertise to recognize what they are seeing.
The Cadean pylons, massive structures that once regulated warp energies across entire sectors, are Necron constructs from the War in Heaven era, though their purpose was not understood until catastrophe struck Cadia in the 41st millennium. The celestial orrery on the tomb world of Thanatos is a three-dimensional map of the entire galaxy, so precise that destroying a star's representation on the orrery causes the actual star to go supernova. This terrifying device dates to the height of Necron power during the war, when the ability to extinguish suns was considered a reasonable tactical option. The Breath of the Gods, a temporal weapon capable of accelerating or reversing time itself in localized areas, is another War in Heaven artifact whose full capabilities remain only partially understood even by the Necrons who wield it. Each of these ancient weapons and devices serves as a reminder of the scale on which the war in heaven was fought, where entire star systems were considered expendable, and reality itself was merely another domain to be conquered and controlled. The webway, that magnificent construction of the Old Ones, bears the scars of the war in heaven throughout its vast network. Sections of the ancient tunnels remain sealed off, quarantined after being breached by demons or infested by enslavers during the conflict's final phase. The Aeldari, who inherited the webway and have maintained it for millions of years, treat these damaged regions with extreme caution, marking them with wards and warnings in languages so ancient that their meanings have been partially forgotten. Some sealed sections contain battlefields frozen in time, where Necron warriors and Aeldari defenders remain locked in eternal combat, their bodies preserved perfectly by the webway's timeless nature. Other breached sections have become homes to warp entities that have existed there for 60 million years, growing strange and powerful in their isolated domains. The Imperium's attempts to access the webway, most notably the Emperor's failed webway project beneath the Imperial Palace, demonstrated how dangerous these ancient passages remain when not properly understood and maintained. The breach caused by Magnus the Red's psychic intrusion, though a catastrophe of the 31st millennium, was merely the latest in a series of webway violations stretching back to the war in heaven itself. The psychological impact of the war in heaven extended far beyond the species directly involved in the conflict. The very nature of the warp was fundamentally altered by the emotions generated during those apocalyptic battles. Before the war, the Imperium was relatively calm, a realm where psychic energy flowed without the predatory consciousness that now characterizes it. The war in heaven changed that forever, pouring such concentrated suffering, hatred, and death into the warp that it created permanent distortions. Some scholars theorize that the Chaos Gods themselves, those terrifying entities that now dominate the warp, were either created or fundamentally empowered by the psychic echo of the war in heaven.
Khorne, the blood god, gorged himself on the violence of billions dying in battle.
Nurgle, the plague lord, fed on despair and the fear of death that permeated the conflict. Chench, the architect of fate, drew power from the desperate schemes and betrayals that characterized the war's final phases. Even Slaanesh, who would not fully manifest until the fall of the Aeldari millions of years later, may have begun its formation in the excessive emotions generated during the ancient conflict. In this sense, the war in heaven never truly ended. Its echoes continue to shape the galaxy through the chaos gods and the corrupted nature of the warp itself. The legacy of the young races created by the Old Ones continues to define galactic civilization in the 41st millennium. The Aeldari, though diminished from their height, remain a significant power, their mastery of psychic arts and access to the webway making them forces to be reckoned with despite their declining numbers. The Orcs, devolved descendants of the Krork, have spread across the entire galaxy as the most numerous and persistent threat faced by nearly every other species. Their instinctive understanding of technology, genetically encoded by the Old Ones, allows them to create weapons and vehicles from scrap that by all logical assessments should not function. The Orcs' love of battle, originally engineered to make them effective warriors against the C'tan, now drives them to attack anything that moves, including each other when no other enemies are available. The fact that Orcs grow larger and more intelligent in response to combat, becoming the apocalyptic war bosses that can threaten entire sectors, is a remnant of the scaling mechanisms the Old Ones built into the Krork design. Every Orc Wa that ravages Imperial space is an echo of the war in heaven, the Old One's legacy of war propagating itself endlessly through time. Humanity's place in the legacy of the war in heaven is complex and often overlooked. Humanity arose naturally rather than through deliberate engineering, evolving on a world that the Old Ones had visited but not extensively modified. Yet humanity inherited a galaxy shaped by the ancient war, with all its blessings and curses. The Emperor of Mankind, in his youth before unification of Terra, is rumored to have encountered C'tan shards, or fragments of Old One knowledge, though such claims are impossible to verify and may be apocryphal. His creation of the Primarchs and Space Marines, while revolutionary by human standards, was in some sense an echo of the Old One's own practices, engineering warriors specifically designed to conquer a hostile galaxy. The Emperor's attempted construction of an Imperial webway, seeking to free humanity from dependence on warp travel, directly paralleled the Old One's solution to the same problem millions of years earlier. Even the Astronomonicon, that psychic beacon that guides Imperial ships through the warp, operates on principles that likely derive from Old One technology, filtered through 60 million years of development and decay. Humanity is thus simultaneously divorced from the war in heaven and deeply connected to it, a latecomer to a galaxy still defined by conflicts that predated humanity's existence by eons. The question of whether the war in heaven could have avoided haunts those few scholars aware of the conflict's full history. If the Old Ones had shared their knowledge with the Necrontyr, would the desperate species have avoided the C'tan's bargain? If they had destroyed the Necrontyr entirely when first attacked, would the C'tan have remained imprisoned in their stars forever? If they had been less profligate in their creation of psychically active servant species, would the warp have remained stable? Each decision made by both sides, reasonable at the time, led inexorably toward catastrophe. The Necrontyr's jealousy was understandable given their suffering. The Old Ones' refusal to help was logical given their fear of what such a bitter species might do with immortality. The Necrontyr's alliance with the C'tan was born of desperation. The Old One's creation of the young races was a rational response to an existential threat. Yet each choice fed into a cycle of escalation that ultimately destroyed the galaxy's ancient paradise and replaced it with an era of eternal war. The war in heaven demonstrates how conflicts can spiral beyond any participant's ability to control, how the pursuit of survival can lead to damnation, and how the scars of war can persist long after the original combatants have departed the stage. The modern Necrons, when they contemplate their species' history at all, face an existential horror that few other species can match. They know, at least those whose consciousness remains intact enough for true introspection, exactly what they have lost. They remember being alive, feeling emotions with the intensity only mortality can provide, experiencing the simple joys of sensation that flesh provides. They know their current existence is a hollow echo of what came before, and they know it can never be restored. The souls that animated their Necrontyr bodies were consumed by the Ceton during biotransference and are gone forever. Even if they could reconstruct organic bodies, what would inhabit them? The current Necron consciousness is a recording, a copy of something that no longer exists. Some Necrons have accepted this and found meaning in their mechanical existence. Trazyn finding purpose in his endless collection of historical artifacts, Imhotep pursuing excellence in military conquest, and Rakir seeking to preserve Necron culture and technology. Others have descended into nihilistic madness, becoming destroyers who seek to eradicate all life as revenge against the universe that cursed them. The most tragic are perhaps those Necrons who cling to denial, maintaining elaborate fantasies that they are still flesh and blood, going through the motions of eating and sleeping despite bodies that need neither, playing roles in a theater where they are simultaneously actor and audience. The Silent King's ultimate fate and intentions remain among the greatest mysteries of the current era. After his return from the intergalactic void, Zarek has worked to unite the Necron dynasties against the Tyranid threat, but his success has been limited. Many dynasties view him with suspicion, remembering that it was his decision that led to biotransference. Others reject the very premise that the Necrons should concern themselves with organic life's survival. Zarek himself has undergone changes during his millions of years wandering between galaxies. He claims to have encountered things in the darkness between galactic arms that make the Tyranids seem almost merciful by comparison. Whether these claims are truth, metaphor, or the delusions of a consciousness that has existed far longer than any mind was meant to endure remains unknown. Some speculate that Zarek seeks to atone for his ancient mistake by ensuring that organic life survives to provide a potential path to reversing biotransference. Others suggest darker motives, that his warnings of extragalactic threats are manipulation designed to return him to absolute power over the Necron species. The Silent King plays a game whose parameters only he fully understands, moving pieces across a board that spans the entire galaxy with objectives that may not be revealed for millennia. The War in Heaven stands as the defining event of galactic history, the moment when the universe's trajectory was permanently altered. Before the war, the galaxy was a garden tended by wise ancients, a place where life flourished under careful stewardship. After the war, it became an arena where species fought for survival against hostile forces, both material and immaterial. The Imperium of man, for all its glory and horror, exists in a universe shaped by decisions made 60 million years before humanity even existed. Every demon that manifests from the warp, every Necron tomb world that awakens, every orc Wa that ravages civilized space, all are consequences of that ancient conflict. The War in Heaven did not simply change the galaxy, it defined what the galaxy would become for all time afterward. The theological implications of the War in Heaven, for those few within the Imperium aware of its existence, are profound and troubling. The Imperial Creed teaches that the Emperor is humanity's God and Savior, but the War in Heaven reveals the existence of beings far older and arguably more powerful than even the Master of Mankind. The Ceton, at their height, wielded powers that the Emperor at his most potent would struggle for match. They consumed stars, shattered planets, and bent reality to their will as easily as breathing.
The Old Ones, in their prime, possessed mastery of biological and psychic sciences that made the Emperor's creation of the Primarchs seem crude by comparison. They seeded life across the entire galaxy, constructed the webway, and survived for millions of years as a civilization, while humanity's entire recorded history spans mere tens of thousands of years. These revelations challenge the fundamental premise of the Imperial faith.
If gods walked the galaxy long before humanity's god arose, if civilizations rose and fell on scales that dwarf humanity's empire, what does that say about humanity's supposed destiny to rule the stars? The Inquisition guards these truths jealously, declaring knowledge of the war in heaven to be the most dangerous heresy, for it reveals that humanity's central place in the cosmos may be nothing more than the arrogance of a species too young to know better. The Mechanicus of Mars, with their worship of the machine god and the Omnicia, occupy a particularly uncomfortable position regarding the war in heaven. Their most sacred world, Mars itself, may house the imprisoned Void Dragon, one of the most powerful Catan. This entity, if the legends are true, has subtly influenced human technological development for millennia, guiding the evolution of machine worship and the relationship between humanity and technology. Every prayer to the machine god, every ritual of maintenance and creation, may in fact be directed toward a star god that seeks only to escape its prison and resume feeding on organic life. The few tech priests who have encountered evidence supporting this theory face a crisis of faith that threatens their sanity. Is the Omnicia they serve truly the Emperor in his aspect as master of technology, or is it the Void Dragon manipulating them towards its eventual freedom? The Mechanicus leadership has suppressed all investigation into these questions, declaring them forbidden knowledge that serves no purpose but to sow doubt. Yet, the questions remain, whispered in the deepest forges of Mars, where only the most trusted adepts dare to speak them aloud. The Aeldari possess the most complete records of the war in heaven among contemporary species, though even their accounts are incomplete and corrupted by the passage of time. The Black Library, that repository of forbidden knowledge hidden within the webway, contains texts describing the creation of the Aeldari species and their role in the ancient war. These records reveal uncomfortable truths about Aeldari origins. They were not the galaxy's natural inheritors, but engineered weapons crafted by the Old Ones to kill Catan. Their legendary psychic abilities, their grace and long lives, all were design traits meant to make them effective warriors. The Aeldari civilization that arose after the war in heaven was built on foundations not of their own making, but inherited from creators who saw them as tools rather than children. This knowledge influences Aeldari philosophy and culture in subtle ways. Their emphasis on individual excellence and the path system may represent attempts to transcend their engineered origins, to become something more than what the Old Ones intended. The Craftworld Aeldari's rigid discipline and the Dark Aeldari's utter abandonment of restraint may both be responses to the same underlying question. If we were created to serve purposes we no longer remember, how do we define ourselves now that those purposes are meaningless? The Orcs represent perhaps the most tragic legacy of the war in heaven, a species whose entire existence is shaped by programming they cannot escape. Every Orc feels an instinctive need for violence, a psychological compulsion to seek out combat and test themselves against worthy opponents. This drive is not a cultural choice, but genetic imperative, encoded into their very DNA by the Old Ones when they created the Krork. The Orcs cannot build a peaceful civilization because peace itself causes them distress at a fundamental level. They grow larger and more intelligent in response to combat, a feature designed to ensure the Krork could scale their capabilities to match whatever threats they faced. But this means that Orcs in peacetime remain small, weak, and miserable, driving them to create conflict even when none exists. The greatest orc war bosses, who achieve something approaching the intelligence and sophistication of the ancient Krork, inevitably lead their wogs to destruction against superior forces, ensuring that the orcs never develop beyond a certain threshold. They are trapped in an eternal cycle of violence and regression, unable to escape the purpose for which they were created 60 million years ago. From one perspective, the orcs are the galaxy's great survivors, a species that has persisted longer than almost any other. From another, they are the war's most pitiable victims, a people enslaved by their own biology to repeat the same patterns until the stars themselves grow cold. The question of whether any Old Ones survived the war in heaven has occupied scholars and mystics for millennia. Official records declare the Old Ones extinct, casualties of the Enslaver Plague and the Satan's genocidal campaigns. Yet there are persistent rumors of ancient beings encountered in the deep void or hidden corners of the webway, creatures of immense power and age that do not match any known species. The Hrud, a mysterious race that manipulates time itself and ages its enemies to dust with its mere presence, are sometimes theorized to be devolved Old Ones, fallen from their former glory but still possessing fragments of their creator's power. The Slan, if they exist beyond myth, are another candidate, reptilian beings of incredible psychic might that vanished from galactic affairs millions of years ago. Some particularly esoteric theories suggest that the Old Ones transcended physical existence entirely, uploading their consciousness into the webway itself or ascending to become beings of pure psychic energy. If this is true, the Old Ones may still exist in some form, watching the galaxy they once nurtured from a perspective beyond mortal comprehension, unable or unwilling to intervene as their creations tear each other apart in endless war. The technology developed during the war in heaven represents capabilities that modern species can barely comprehend, let alone replicate. The Necrons at their height could extinguish stars, manipulate time, phase through solid matter, and construct megastructures on galactic scales. Their weapons operated on principles that current physics cannot explain, drawing energy from dimensions that standard science cannot detect. The Blackstone fortresses, massive space stations scattered throughout the galaxy, are believed to be Old One constructs or possibly joint Necron-Old One projects from before the war began. These fortresses can channel and manipulate warp energy on scales that dwarf anything the Imperium can achieve. Yet their control mechanisms remain largely incomprehensible to those who discover them. The dolmen dates, which allow Necrons to force entry into the webway despite having no natural connection to the warp, represent technology that bypasses fundamental rules of reality. Each of these ancient devices, when activated, performs miracles that modern scientists can observe but not reproduce, demonstrating the vast gulf between contemporary understanding and the knowledge possessed by the War in Heaven's combatants. The Necron awakening that has accelerated in recent millennia represents the war's echoes growing louder rather than fading. As more tomb worlds come online and more dynasties rejoin the galaxy's politics, the possibility of a renewed war in heaven grows from theoretical to imminent. The Necrons possess both the technology and motivation to reclaim their former empire. They view organic species as upstart children squatting in their house, and many dynasties are committed to clearing out these interlopers through whatever means necessary. The Imperium, spread thin across the galaxy and besieged on all fronts, lacks the resources to face a fully awakened Necron empire. The Aeldari, though ancient and wise, are too few in number to mount effective resistance against legions that number in the billions. The Tau, advanced though they are, have barely begun to comprehend the scope of the threat the Necrons represent. If even half of the Necron tomb worlds wake successfully, if the major dynasties can overcome their differences long enough to coordinate action, the resulting war could make the Horus Heresy look like a border skirmish.
Yet the Necrons themselves are not unified in their goals or methods, and this internal division may be the only factor preventing them from overwhelming all opposition. Some dynasties, like the Sautek under Pharaoh Imhotep, seek to rebuild the Necron Empire through methodical conquest, establishing absolute control over their territories before expanding outward. Others, like the Nyalox dynasty, adopt defensive postures, determined to hold what they claim but not particularly interested in expansion. The more eccentric overlords pursue entirely personal agendas. Trazyn the Infinite collects historical artifacts and living specimens, occasionally intervening in contemporary conflicts solely to acquire interesting additions to his galleries. Orican the Diviner manipulates events across centuries to prove the accuracy of his astrological predictions, with the fate of entire civilizations mattering less to him than being proven correct. Illuminor Sheras continues his experiments in biotransference and consciousness transfer, seeking to perfect the process that doomed his species, or perhaps to reverse it entirely. These competing agendas create a situation where Necron forces might attack Imperial worlds one day and defend them from Tyranids the next, all in service to goals that make sense only to mechanical minds operating on timescales measured in millennia. The Khaton shards, imprisoned throughout the galaxy in Necron Tesseract labyrinths, represent perhaps the most dangerous single threat remaining from the War in Heaven. Each shard, though only a fragment of its original whole, possesses reality-warping powers that defy conventional understanding.
The shards are conscious, malevolent, and endlessly patient. They have had 60 million years to contemplate their imprisonment and devise strategies for escape. Some work on their captors psychologically, subtly manipulating Necron overlords through carefully crafted suggestions that seem to serve Necron interests while actually advancing the shard's agenda. Others probe their prisons constantly, testing for weaknesses in the Tesseract labyrinths that contain them, seeking any flaw that might be exploited. A few shards have achieved limited freedom, existing as avatars of their former selves that can manifest for short periods before being pulled back into confinement. These brief manifestations are catastrophic for anyone nearby, as the Ceton shard exercises its power without restraint, feeding on life energy and reshaping reality according to its whims. The relationship between the Ceton shards and the full chaos gods of the warp represents one of the most fascinating and terrifying aspects of contemporary galactic metaphysics. The Ceton and chaos gods are fundamentally opposed, beings of pure material force versus entities of pure warp energy, yet both are drawn to feeding on mortal suffering and death. When Ceton shards manifest near sites of heavy chaos corruption, the two sets of forces interact in ways that defy explanation. Reality itself becomes unstable, with the material universe and immaterium bleeding into each other in localized zones where the normal laws of existence cease to apply. Troops unfortunate enough to fight in these contested zones report experiencing simultaneous demonic possession and Ceton time manipulation, aging decades in seconds while their bodies are hijacked by warp entities, or watching fellow soldiers transform into creatures that are simultaneously mechanical and organic, neither fully real nor fully immaterial. These reality-warped zones eventually collapse, usually taking entire continents with them, as the fundamental incompatibility between Ceton and Chaos proves unsustainable even in the galaxy's current degraded state. The Tyranids, that extragalactic threat that motivated Sharek to return from his self-imposed exile, represent a new kind of apocalypse that neither the Old Ones nor the Ceton could have anticipated. The Tyranids are not merely another species competing for resources. They are a galaxy-consuming swarm that treats entire star systems as fuel to be processed and moved past. Their strategy of consuming all biomass means that worlds attacked by Tyranids are left completely dead, stripped down to bare rock with no possibility of recovery.
For the Necrons, this represents an existential threat of a different kind than they faced during the War in Heaven. The Ceton and Old Ones at least left ruins behind, remnants of civilization that could be rebuilt. The Tyranids leave nothing, and worse, their consumption of all organic life threatens the Necrons' long-term goal of reversing biotransference. If the galaxy is scoured clean of biological templates, what forms would the Necrons return to even if they could reverse their transformation? This shared threat has led to unprecedented situations where Necron and Imperial forces have fought alongside each other against Tyranid invasions, temporary alliances born of mutual desperation rather than trust or friendship.
The Great Rift's opening in the 41st millennium, that massive warp storm stretching across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the Haddix anomaly, has created conditions eerily similar to those at the end of the War in Heaven. The warp is more turbulent now than at any time since the Enslaver Plague, with demonic incursions becoming commonplace and entire sectors falling to chaos corruption. The boundaries between real space and the Imperium are thinner than they have been in 60 million years, allowing entities from both realms to cross over with unprecedented ease. Some Necron cryptechs who have studied the phenomenon claim that the galaxy is approaching a tipping point similar to what occurred when the Enslaver Plague began. If the warp continues to strengthen and the barriers continue to weaken, a second Enslaver Plague or something even worse could sweep across the galaxy, rendering all conventional conflicts meaningless as reality itself collapses into the Imperium. This possibility has driven some unlikely alliances, with Necron dynasties cooperating with Eldar Farseers to strengthen the barriers between worlds, both species recognizing that their ancient enmity matters little if the galaxy ceases to exist as a place where either can survive. The Emperor's current state, entombed upon the Golden Throne and maintaining the Astronomonicon through psychic efforts, bears uncomfortable parallels to the Old Ones' final days. Like the Old Ones, the Emperor fights a war on multiple fronts simultaneously, maintaining barriers against demonic incursion while also sustaining infrastructure necessary for his empire's survival. Like the Old Ones, he has created warrior species, the Space Marines and to some extent the Primarchs, designed to fight enemies that regular humans cannot face. Like the Old Ones, he has dabbled in webway construction, attempting to free his people from dependence on the dangerous warp. The Emperor's attempted webway project, though it failed catastrophically when Magnus breached it, represented an attempt to replicate what the Old Ones achieved millions of years earlier. Whether the Emperor has somehow accessed Old One knowledge, perhaps through archaeological discoveries or psychic contact with Old One remnants, or whether he independently developed similar solutions to similar problems, remains unknown. What is clear is that humanity under the Emperor has followed a developmental path remarkably similar to that of the Old Ones, raising disturbing questions about whether this path inevitably leads to the same destination, extinction or transformation into something no longer recognizably human. The various Necron dynasties' attitudes toward organic life range from genocidal hatred to cautious pragmatism to something approaching respect. The destroyer cults represent the most extreme position, viewing all organic life as a disease to be eradicated, with the Necrons serving as the cure. These nihilistic warriors have embraced their mechanical nature completely, seeing flesh not as something to be reclaimed, but as weakness to be purged from the galaxy. Other dynasties take more nuanced approaches. The Sawtech dynasty, under Imhotep, practices a form of brutal pragmatism, willing to negotiate with organic species when it serves their purposes, while also conducting wars of extermination when those species prove troublesome. Trajan's approach is almost preservationist, viewing organic civilizations as sources of artifacts and specimens to be collected and maintained in stasis for historical study. The most complex position belongs to those Necrons who still remember their Necrontyr existence with sufficient clarity to mourn what was lost. These individuals sometimes display behaviors that could almost be called empathetic, recognizing in organic species struggles echoes of their own ancient suffering. They may spare worlds that would otherwise be destroyed, not out of mercy, but out of a reluctance to inflict on others the fate they themselves endured. The possibility of the Chiton reassembling themselves haunts every strategic calculation involving the imprisoned shards. The star gods were shattered, not destroyed, and theoretically, if enough shards of a single Chiton were gathered in one location, they might be able to merge back into a more complete form. The Necrons guard against this carefully, with most dynasties deliberately keeping their Chiton shards separated from other shards of the same entity. Yet the shards themselves work toward reunion, using their limited windows of manifestation to subtly influence events across vast distances and timescales. A shard of the Deceiver imprisoned in one dynasty's vaults might manipulate that dynasty into war with another dynasty that possesses a different Deceiver shard, hoping that the chaos of battle might provide opportunity for both shards to escape and merge. The most terrifying scenario involves a coordinated effort by multiple shards across numerous dynasties, a conspiracy operating over centuries or millennia that could result in the reformation of an entire Chiton. Such an entity, even if weaker than the original pre-shattering Chiton, would still possess power sufficient to threaten entire sectors and would presumably be consumed by rage against the Necrons who imprisoned it. The War in Heaven's influence extends even to the mysterious webway itself, that incomprehensible construction that predates every contemporary civilization. Modern scholars debate whether the webway was purely an Old One creation or whether they adapted something even older. Some sections of the webway demonstrate architectural styles and construction techniques that differ significantly from others, suggesting multiple builders or at least multiple construction phases. The dolmen gates that allow Necrons to access the webway operate on principles entirely different from the Old One's psychic portals, yet they interact with the same underlying infrastructure. This suggests that the webway may have been a collaborative project between the Old Ones and another species, possibly the Necrontyr, before biotransference, when they still possessed organic forms and at least limited psychic potential. If this theory is correct, the webway represents not just an Old One legacy, but a memorial to a time when the galaxy's ancient powers cooperated rather than fought. The bitter irony is that this monument to cooperation became a primary battlefield during the War in Heaven and remains a contested space in contemporary conflicts. Among the Inquisition's most closely guarded secrets are reports from inquisitors who have encountered what they describe as Old One ruins or technology. These accounts are invariably classified beyond the highest security levels and typically result in the reporting inquisitor being quietly disappeared or assigned to permanent duty monitoring some distant, uninhabited sector. The few fragments of these reports that have leaked into wider circulation describe installations that operate on principles beyond any known science. Devices that manipulate life itself as easily as Imperial tech priests manipulate circuits, and biological entities that appear to be half creature and half machine, but are fully alive in ways that defy explanation. One particularly disturbing report describes a world where evolution appears to be accelerating, with species developing from single-celled organisms to sentient tool users within a few centuries, guided by ancient machinery still operating after millions of years. If such installations exist and remain active, they suggest the Old Ones may have prepared contingencies for their civilization's collapse, fail-safe systems designed to rebuild galactic civilization even after their creator's extinction. Whether these systems view humanity and other current species as successors to be nurtured or as obstacles to be cleared away remains unknown. The psychological weight of the War in Heaven's history affects different species in different ways. For the Necrons, who actually remember the war, it is a source of endless regrets and diminishing hope.
Every awakening brings fresh awareness of how much they have lost, how meaningless their victory proved to be, and how distant the goal of reclaiming flesh has become. For the Aeldari, knowledge of their created origins as warrior servants is a source of both pride and shame. They take pride in having been deemed worthy of creation by the Old Ones, but feel shame at being tools rather than children, weapons instead of heirs. For humanity, the few humans who learn of the war in heaven experience a profound existential crisis. The realization that humanity's entire history, from the first stone tools to the Imperium spanning the galaxy, represents merely the blink of an eye compared to civilizations that rose and fell millions of years before humanity's ancestors even existed, forces a reckoning with humanity's insignificance that few minds can process without breaking. The Imperium's insistence on humanity's central role in the galaxy, the Emperor's manifest destiny to rule the stars, becomes revealed as provincial ignorance when measured against the true scope of galactic history. The fate of the lesser Citan, those star gods about whom little is recorded, represents another open question. The major Citan, like the Nightbringer, Deceiver, and Void Dragon, are documented in multiple sources, but fragmentary records suggest there were dozens or possibly hundreds of other Citan that were either consumed by their siblings, shattered and lost, or escaped to unknown destinations. Some may have fled the galaxy entirely when the Necrons rebelled, retreating to the intergalactic void where they continue to feed on distant stars beyond the reach of organic vengeance.
Others might have been so thoroughly shattered that their fragments dispersed across the galaxy as individual atoms of self-aware matter, incapable of acting, but still conscious, experiencing an eternity of isolation and powerlessness as ultimate punishment for their crimes against creation. A few accounts, considered apocryphal even by Necron standards, suggest that some Citan successfully transferred their consciousness into other media, abandoning their necrodermis shells for forms of energy or matter that could not be tracked or imprisoned. If true, these escapees might still exist somewhere in the galaxy, pursuing agendas incomprehensible to beings that experience time linearly and exist in only 3 spatial dimensions. The war in Heaven's End marked not just the conclusion of a conflict, but the end of an age where the galaxy's destiny was guided by intelligent design. The Old Ones had directed galactic development for millions of years, carefully nurturing species and ecosystems according to plans whose full scope remains unknown. Their extinction left the galaxy to develop organically, without supervision or guidance, and the results have been chaotic at best. Species evolved that the Old Ones never intended. Civilizations arose that followed paths the ancient gardeners never anticipated. And the careful balance the Old Ones had maintained collapsed into the current state of perpetual war. Some philosophers argue that this chaos represents freedom, that the galaxy is better off without ancient overlords directing its development, regardless of how benevolent those overlords might have been. Others see only waste and tragedy, imagining what wonders might have been achieved if the Old Ones had survived to continue their work. The question is ultimately unanswerable, as there is no way to know what path the galaxy would have followed if the war in heaven had never occurred or had ended differently. What is certain is that every species currently fighting for survival exists in a galaxy that was broken 60 million years ago and has never truly healed. The ultimate irony of the war in heaven is that nobody truly won. The Necrontyr sought immortality and freedom from suffering, but achieved only eternal imprisonment in metal shells devoid of sensation. The Old Ones sought to maintain their garden paradise, but saw it burn and themselves driven to extinction. The Citan gained physical forms and fed on entire civilizations, but were shattered and imprisoned for their efforts. The young races created to fight the war inherited a galaxy stripped of its ancient paradise and infested with demonic horrors.
The only winners, if they can be called that, are the Chaos Gods, entities that fed on the war's suffering and emerged strengthened, now powerful enough to threaten the entire material universe. Every other participant paid a price that exceeded any possible benefit, trapped in a conflict where victory and defeat became indistinguishable from each other. The War in Heaven stands as the ultimate cautionary tale about the cost of war, demonstrating that even conflicts fought on godlike scales with reality-warping weapons can only produce losers, with the sole question being how much each side loses.
As the 41st millennium progresses and the galaxy descends deeper into chaos, the possibility of a literal second war in heaven grows more plausible with each passing year. The Necrons are awakening in increasing numbers, their dynasties beginning to coordinate action on scales not seen since the Great Sleep. The forces of chaos grow stronger as the Great Rift pumps demonic energy into real space, with greater demons manifesting more frequently and remaining manifest for longer periods. The Tyranids continue their approach from beyond the galactic rim, consuming everything in their path and leaving only silence behind. Ancient technologies from the War in Heaven era are being rediscovered and activated, often by individuals who have no understanding of what they have found or what consequences their actions might trigger. The ingredients for apocalypse are assembling themselves, and the galaxy stands on a precipice that may dwarf even the horror of the Horus Heresy. If this new war ignites in full, it will be fought with weapons and forces that make contemporary conflicts seem quaint by comparison, and the outcome will determine not just who rules the galaxy, but whether the galaxy continues to exist as a place where life can survive at all. In the end, the War in Heaven endures not as a historical event, but as a living presence in the galaxy's DNA. Every structure of contemporary civilization, every faction's capabilities and limitations, every threat that plagues humanity and other species, all derive from decisions made and actions taken during that ancient conflict. The Imperium fights desperately to maintain the Astronomicon and hold back chaos, yet both chaos's power and the necessity of the Astronomicon stem from how the War in Heaven corrupted the warp. The Aeldari struggle with their fall and the constant threat of Slaanesh, yet their psychic nature that makes them vulnerable to such threats was engineered into them by the Old Ones as a weapon. The Orcs' constant warfare and inability to build lasting civilizations are direct consequences of their creation as war-optimized beings. The Necrons' awakening threatens every species with extinction, yet the Necrons themselves are victims, a civilization that committed species-wide suicide to escape suffering, only to discover they had damned themselves to something worse than death. The War in Heaven is not past. It is the foundation upon which the present is built, the wound from which all subsequent conflicts bleed, the original sin that continues to shape galactic destiny 60 million years after the last shots were fired.